Hello, I'm Robert Jackson. I'm based at NIAB in Cambridge, and I've been given the opportunity to talk to you about sustaining wheat yields under, well, heat and drought stress and recovery. Some of the work we've been doing in FP3 as part of the Tigris project. So I think to start with, it's probably worth reminding everyone the importance of wheat to humanity globally. So wheat contributes extensively to the number of calories consumed by humans. It's one of the major produced crops globally, particularly in India, where India is one of the largest producers of wheat. And the UK itself also produces a lot of wheat considering its size. And because of this, it's economically quite valuable both to the countries, the states it's grown, but also to the farmers, where it is one of their main crops and therefore main sources of income. And then when you consider the previous the green revolution we've had before, very effective in India, increased wheat yields quite a lot, even more so than the global average. UK, again, because of the climate, manages to produce decent wheat yields. But in reality, when you look at the highest yield achieved, there's still some room for improvement as a crop, whether it be by breeding or agronomy. Having said all that, wheat production will come under threat due to the impacts of climate change. I think some of the other talks in these series will have been looking at water extraction and water use within the Punjab and wider India. And this is a serious issue for wheat, where it is 70% of it in India is actually produced with irrigation. It's not just India that's going to have issues. In the UK, where we're traditionally quite a rainy country, we end up with periods of drought now compared to historic averages, and these weather events are going to become more often and less regular or less predictable. And on top of all that, as we all know, global temperatures are rising. So what this is going to mean is there's actually going to be, by 2050, you can have up to a 23% production gap in India. And if India is not producing enough wheat to sustain itself, this could be a humanitarian crisis, because who knows where else is going to be able to produce it and what effects they're having. And economically, it's also going to be devastating to people as well. I mean, in 2019, we had a very good growing season for wheat in the UK. In 2020, it was a very hot, dry summer. And this knocked off about 40% of the value of the wheat market. So there are issues there that need to be dealt with. What are we doing in Tigris, particularly Flagship Project 3, to try and alleviate some of these issues? So our main aim is to identify whether it be traits, genes, or lines that can confer tolerance to either heat or drought stress, and then to deploy these via breeding, so actually get them into the market and to the end users. And on top of that, as you're studying all of these aspects of heat and drought tolerance, you can also look at the agronomic or changes in management of the crop to see if that will help with the changing environment. So with that in mind, I'd just like to talk you through some of the work we've actually been doing. I'm going to focus on drought to begin with, and this is how we look at drought within the field in both India and the UK. Here is India. The way you study drought in the field is simple. You essentially have the same experiment twice. In one half of it, you study it under ideal conditions, so the right amount of moisture. And the other half of the trial, you would exclude water, so whether that be rain or irrigation or any combination. From there, as the crop is growing, you then need to basically assess it at different stages. So and this is quite a manual and labor-intensive process, a lot of staring down at a crop, measuring height, plants per meter squared, green cover. Later in the season, you break the crop down into its distinct parts, so size of grain. In this case, we're looking at the grain biomass compared to the biomass of the rest of the plant and how that's being changed by drought. And again, if you're thinking about drought, you want to be thinking about the root structure as well. So again, that's being analysed. As I mentioned, some of this is quite labour intensive. At NIAB, we've been moving towards an automated aspect of that, and the Tigris project has provided us an opportunity to work on trials to look at that. Then ultimately you want to look at the yield, so the actual what you get off the combine, and then try and analyse how all of these different traits can work towards that. So that's what we've been doing. This is what we've got out of it so far. So at NIAB, we're quite lucky in the sense that we have quite a diverse wheat population with which we can work. It's been produced over many years. It's very popular with breeders in the UK, and from that we've managed to select 18 lines that we can grow in the field that may confer some level of drought tolerance. Having analysed that in the field and just looking at yield, this index here is looking at yield in both stressed environments and non-stressed environments. So stress for when we do have the stress, non-stress for those years where it is actually growing quite nicely in the UK. And from there, you can see that a couple of the experimental lines highlighted here have actually done quite well in both environments. In fact, they're outperforming one of the more commonly grown commercial controlled Skyfall. And again, at NIAB, we have quite a nice pipeline for moving crops or lines into breeding programs, and at least one of these lines is already in that pipeline. So that's a good first step. The next step is, and what we're doing now, is to try and identify how the traits that we've measured contribute to this drought tolerance in these lines, whereas they're not necessarily contributing in others. And from that, you can either, well, you'll aim to build a combination of traits that confer drought tolerance. And again, that can be used by breeders to look for lines with drought tolerance in their crop, in their breeding program. And again, go to market. Right, so this is an India UK project. The India side of things is done at PAU, and they've done a similar sort of thing. They've taken some of their populations, they've selected for those that will have drought or ability to respond to drought. They've evaluated them in the field in a similar way, and they've found some lines that are very tolerant to drought. And again, they have a pipeline for getting this into the breeding programs in India. It'll be interesting to see how the traits they identify as conferring drought tolerance compares to the ones in the UK. And on top of all of that, they're also looking much more in detail at the root architecture and how that's affected by drought. So that's covered drought. I'd now just like to move on to heat before I move on to the future of the project. So heat has been studied at Rothamsted, and it's been studied in conjunction with other projects such as Designing Future Wheat and some Newton-funded and UKRI-funded work. So for the heat tolerance work, the team wanted to look at the stress earlier in the season, or early in the growing cycle of the wheat, whereas most other heat stress looks later, whereas earlier stress is probably more applicable to parts of India, especially with the changes in climate we're going to see. Because of that, they're looking at something that's called the tillering stage, which is basically when the plant is producing more and more stems. Again, reaching into their populations, they identified a tolerant line. As you can see here, the tolerant line is having much less of, or being affected much less than the intolerant line by heat stress. From there, they went down a slightly different route to the rest of us. They went more molecular, so they looked at the processes underlying this tolerance within the plant. And from that, they've been able to identify genes that are related to these processes that can confer heat tolerance. From those genes, they can be used in other populations around the world to identify other potentially heat tolerant lines, and again, take them forward. That's the bulk of the work we aim to do at the start of the project, and this is just a little bit of a highlight as to what we've achieved, or what Tigris has allowed us to achieve going forward, or will allow us to achieve going forward. So I talked about drought. Most of the focus on drought in research is on terminal drought, which is similar to what we've looked at, which is basically when drought occurs, it stays for the growth or the whole growth cycle of the plant. Now, one of the main reasons we do that is because it's easier to look at, and it also replicates most drought environments, particularly the ones, particularly some important ones such as Australia. However, in reality, in the UK and India, especially with changing weather events, periodic drought, in India they'll irrigate as well. What you end up with is periods of drought where you need tolerance, and then when the irrigation or rain comes, then you get a period of recovery. So tolerance is still useful during this, but you also want to be looking at how plants recover after stress and the benefits there. Because ideally a faster recovering plant will be better at responding to drought stress if it's drought and then recovery. And this is where Tigris really comes into its own as a project. Within the project, we've been able to identify lines that confer drought tolerance. We've been able to look at those, or we'll be able to take some of those from the field trial at NIAB and put them into a glass house. But because the Tigris project is multidisciplinary, we've been able to work with other FPs, specifically the University of Essex with a group led by Tracy Lawson, who's also interested in the effects of drought recovery, but has expertise in photosynthesis, which is a key component of recovery within the plant. Because of that, we've been able to look at the effect of drought recovery at two specific growth stages, stem extension and flowering. And this is allowing us to ask two major questions. To what extent does recovery actually happen after the stress or once the stress is relieved? And what traits are involved in that? And what do you want to be looking for if you want to try and breed for recovery? And also, does an initial stress prime the plants for later stresses? So that's some of the expected work, and hopefully that work will lead into future grants and extra collaboration between the different institutes involved. So something unexpected that kind of came out of Tigris is, well, globally we had the global pandemic, and that had a real effect on labour availability, both in the UK and India. And labour is an important part of plant breeding and plant research. And without that labour, it became quite difficult to do some of the work we need to do. At NIAB, we'd already been moving towards the automated side of things, which is flying a drone around a trial. This can then be used to construct 3D images of the whole trial. You can zoom in, look at the height of the plots and the crop cover. It's all very useful, but it does require quite a lot of expertise. At NIAB, there's 5 people involved in that, quite highly trained people, and it requires quite a large cash outlay. So what we proposed and got some extra funding to do at the end of the Tigris project is to try and make this more accessible. So essentially, what we were doing is producing an outline as to how to make something like this. So it will be a support structure with a set of sensors at the top that outline a plot to be imaged. These images are then transferred to either an open source app on a phone or a computer. And this can be converted into data that's useful to the researcher, in this case, green area. And the benefits here are it's easier to do. One person can cover a larger area. And as a general rule, this is less subjective than the human eye. Because if you imagine 2 or 3 people working in the field, they may have different views as to what is happening in one plot. And this is already being used to contribute to future grants as well. So it's a good end product and may hopefully, if it's open source and used internationally, can also be of benefit to places where remote sensing is harder to access. So just a couple of conclusions to end the talk with. Wheat yields are going to be impacted by drought and heat stress. We have been able to identify some lines that may be able to alleviate some of the drought stress. The next step is to look at the traits involved in this that can then be used in breeding programs. Genes involved in heat tolerance have been produced or identified, and again, they're already being assessed in other material internationally. And finally, a focus on tolerance alone may not be enough. You may also want to look at recovery, whether it be in heat or drought stress. Just to end the talk then, I'd just like to thank everyone involved in the project, Alison, who was at NIAB and left, to go take up a position, very senior wheat position at CIMMYD, and everyone else who's been involved in the project and the additional funding involved. Right, thank you very much.